Anoosh, let's just start with you because you actually went on the ground to a couple of the hotels that have become hotspots for riots. You went to Epping and you also went to Dis in Norfolk. Before we get into kind of what you found on the basis of your feature, just tell us a bit about, what's that like? You turn up at a hotel and, I don't know, you wait outside and hope people are going to talk to you. You talk to protesters.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what you do. In Dis, there had been protests that turned aggressive outside a hotel called the Park Hotel, which had been housing asylum seekers, families with children. But the Home Office had suddenly imposed a plan to move them out and move in just solely single men, asylum seekers, into that hotel. And that was the cause of the recent protests there. And in Epping, there's been numerous protests, one that turned violent outside the Bell Hotel, which is a hotel housing male asylum seekers, one of whom has been charged with a count of sexual assault, which he denies and is in custody. And that was the spark for the protests around that hotel. And so going to go and cover them, yeah, I mean, it's a case of going to the town, speaking to people about how they feel about these hotels on their doorsteps, also trying to speak to the people who are living in the hotels as well to get their perspective on what it's like to be sort of at the epicenter of such resentment and anger.
And how evident is it on sort of in both of those camps, the tensions and the level of discontent?
So evident. When I went to Dis, which is, I don't know if you've ever been, but it's like quite a quaint town in Norfolk. There's wool shops on the high street with like Wallace and Gromit in the window and, stalls selling a hog roast with crackling. And it's quite sort of got that English quaint charm.
Yeah.
But the moment I hit the high street, I could hear people unprompted talking about, there's going to be just men in there. We don't know who they are. I literally overheard people conversing about it before I'd even brought it up. I had my notebook out. One guy came up to me and went, come on then, let's go up there and ask, basically saying, let's go and cause some trouble at the hotel. I was just like, I'm just a journalist. So that it definitely felt that the atmosphere felt tense. There were lots of police. And when I went to the actual hotel, there were security guards. They were like, this is private land, get off. It was very, there was a confrontational atmosphere, even though it was just it was just the afternoon. I wasn't going to cover any particular protest action that was happening that day. And Epping was similar. I went to one of the protests there, one that remained peaceful. But again, someone did stick a camera in my face and ask me what my position was on this. And, I had to just kind of walk away and they were going, are you deaf? Can't you hear me? I don't know where that footage was going to be streamed. So I really didn't want to be on that. And of course, I'm only there as a reporter. I'm not there as someone who is either a protester or a counter-protester. But there was definitely a hostile atmosphere in both places. And in other places where protests have broken out, there's numerous sites around the UK where this has been happening this summer, almost a reflection of what was happening this time last year following the murders of those girls in Southport. So there is the title of your piece, George, a really great piece in the New Statesman this week, Summer of Discontent. That's how it felt to me.
And George, we'll talk about your piece, which kind of zooms out on some of the various issues facing the government in the second half. But how much do you think that sense of tension, discontent, unrest that Anoosh is talking about has sort of got through to people in the government? Are they aware of the levels of tension that she's talking about?
Absolutely. Look, I think it's a matter of huge concern to the government, partly because I think asylum hotels have just become a symbol of what's gone wrong with the country. Massive cost to the taxpayer, sort of chaotic system. And of course, a big part of it was the Conservatives' failed Rwanda scheme, which led to a huge slowdown in processing and signing contracts with private companies such as Circa, which the government's now locked into, in some cases, until 2029.
Some people are making an awful lot of money out of this, aren't they?
Indeed. And it's one of the biggest issues that Yvette Cooper and the Home Office are grappling with. So they are trying to renegotiate those contracts where they can. They have reduced the number of asylum seekers in hotels. Obviously, they're trying to reduce the amount of small boats, such as through the deal with France. But you have some in Labour who want far more radical solutions. One influential MP told me this week that they would like to see the government requisition land from the Duchy of Lancaster and set up Nightingale-style accommodations, reference to the
hospitals in COVID.
The makeshift Nightingale hospitals we saw during COVID.
Yeah. Well, the hotel point is really emotive. And one of the things that I came across in your feature, Anoosh, is this kind of disconnect between what people think about when they imagine being housed in a hotel, because most of us have been to hotels and it's nice, it's a treat, it's a holiday, and what the reality is of living in a hotel for months, sometimes years on end, if you are a migrant family waiting for your case to be processed. Can you tell us a bit about sort of what the reality is like inside these hotels?
Yes, I think first of all it's important to remember that the assumption among a lot of people, they hear the word hotel and they think this is a 5-star experience. They're getting their fresh sheets every morning, they're getting room service, they're getting, all of this stuff laid on for them as if they're on holiday. That's not the case from people that I've spoken to over years in these asylum hotels. I've seen a 4-year-old boy whose body was scarred by bedbug bites because there were so many bed bugs in the hotel. They wouldn't sort it out for them. They just told them sleep in long-sleeved clothes. I've seen people poisoned by the food in the hotels, undercooked meat. One of the hotels that I covered for this feature, I heard that there was such little breakfast on. Sometimes the children of some of the families there would go hungry, that it was so unclean that the women were actually asking the public for donations of buckets and mops. So it's not, it's not a paradise. But I think the problem is that these hotels are sometimes much loved venues in the heart of towns that don't have that many places to congregate and don't have that many places that can put on big functions like wedding receptions,
you talked
birthday
about
parties.
Events being cancelled. That's hugely emotive if your wedding or your sort of 60th birthday party is cancelled because the hotel's suddenly been requisitioned by the Home Office.
Yeah, exactly. They're suddenly requisitioned, they close, and things are cancelled last minute and deposits are lost. And, people are disappointed because they've been looking forward to an event that meant something to them and their family. I came across people on the high street in Dis who said, they used to do lovely Christmas dinners at the Park Hotel. We used to go there for Christmas lunch. And so I think this is such a short-sighted policy brought in by the Conservatives, a few years ago, of sort of lack of respect for people's pride in place and also people's day-to-day lives. And I write in the piece, it's almost like a parable for everything that's wrong with the British state today. So, not only cuts to the asylum claims processing system, the outsourcing that is very poor value, but also the neglect of neighbourhoods, just not thinking how this is going to play out on people's doorstep. And
George, are there alternatives? You mentioned one MP suggesting sort of Nightingale-style accommodation. The Conservatives had the idea of, we'll house them on the Bibby Stockholm barge, which actually Anoosh also went to visit. And there have been suggestions of housing them in sort of military barracks, converted prisons was one idea at one point. You get various politicians on the right saying, just put them in tents. Sort of, are all of these ideas in the mix? How does what Labour is planning to do on just the practical element of processing asylum claims differ from what the Conservatives are trying to do, or does it not differ?
Well, Labour is aiming to move them into cheaper accommodation when possible. But when I said to the Home Office, look, why don't you simply close down the asylum hotels now? Because this is a charge that gets thrown at the government a lot. Like 2029 is just too late. And they made 2 points. One around the contracts, and obviously there would be the prohibitive cost of breaking them, but also around the duty to prevent destitution. That if you just simply shut down the asylum hotels, you would see a big spike in homelessness, and there are laws in place that guard against destitution.
Yeah, I guess it's the issue of what you've got to have somewhere to put them, and
and then where you end up putting them is in HMOs, so houses of multiple occupancy,
which the council also wants to use for tackling homelessness and
for temporary accommodation for people who haven't come here as asylum seekers but who just don't have a place to live. And so you've got this weird situation where the Home Office is sometimes gazumping councils for temporary accommodation to use for asylum seekers rather than locals who don't have houses. So you can see how that resentment builds up, particularly when these HMOs spring up in mostly in areas of cheaper housing. So maybe already a more deprived area than the average suddenly gets all of these houses with multiple people living in them. They're not built for that many people. And so you get, problems with litter and fly tipping and neglect of the property on the part of the landlords who rent these places out. And you also do just get the chaos of people, strangers who are desperate living at close quarters. It's not what people want in their neighbourhoods. So I think that's also, it's less of a sort of symbol, because these hotels, everyone can see them in the town centre or on the high street. The HMOs are probably more hidden, but that's also a sort of site of resentment that's bubbling up in some communities.
Yeah, I just think what's interesting about your reporting on this is that, as well as the very sort of understandable public anger about these venues being requisitioned, or about feeling that their communities are being sort of cast aside by people in Westminster who just sort of dictate these people are going here, these people are going there. You also, though, write that there is a sort of sympathy in some elements towards the people staying in these hotels, particularly, and this is what I found really interesting, the hotel where it's currently migrant families and the children are going to the local schools, and the families, the parents are volunteering, because obviously they're not allowed to work, so they're sort of volunteering in the community. And the suggestion that they might be moved out to house predominantly migrant single men, and the response from that being actually quite nuanced by some individuals.
Yeah, so a lot of people who I interviewed said, it was all right when it was just families. So there's definitely a fear and anger about groups of men coming to a local area. And, there's the specific allegation in Epping, and there have actually been in another hotel in Norfolk, 2 men who have been given jail sentences for their crimes. So, it's really difficult to talk about. But what the problem is that's happening is that all of these men are being tarred with the same brush. So you've got these specific stories, but then all of these men are being demonized. And that's a big problem, because when you are made to feel like a criminal, which is what some of them who spoke to me told me they were being made to feel, you're more likely to put your hood up, to walk fast, to walk in, groups of people, to try and keep yourself safe. Someone I spoke to in Epping had been chased by a group of men while he just went to go and buy food from the supermarket. So I think, that they seem very nervous and scared. And they told me that they were, because they're being sort of criminalized by this wider feeling that they're all, here to do something wrong or to hurt people, or there's a lot of accusations about antisocial behaviour and shop theft. I actually asked Essex.
You asked Tesco's, didn't you?
Yeah, I asked Tesco and I asked Essex Police, and, these are unsubstantiated. So I think the problem is that, there is discrimination going on here, and that's causing, an antagonism between the two groups.
Finally, was there anything that you wanted to include in the piece, but obviously you did multiple days of reporting, it's hard to fit anything in, that you want to share with podcast listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I did want to, it was really hard to describe the atmosphere of, this guy coming up, bounding up to me and being like, come on then, let's go up there, let's go to the hotel, let's ask them to speak to us. That felt quite sort of spicy to me, and sort of like the tensions are very, very close to the surface in these places. But something I did want to put in the piece, but I just couldn't because there was too much dialogue involved, was there was some people that I interviewed who were very, very angry about the asylum seekers, saying that they were given everything when they were working their asses off and getting nothing. That was one of the quotes. That was their perception of what was happening. And then they pointed to this sort of Turkish takeaway called Istanbul on the high street and said, Istanbul's been here years. I respect them. They came here and they started a business. They're giving back to the economy. That's the kind of immigration that we need. So I think one of the issues is that these asylum seekers aren't allowed to work, and people, that adds to this impression that they're sort of scrounging off the British state. And so maybe there's something that the government could consider there, although obviously every time you mention that to someone in government, they say that would be an incentive for coming over.
Yeah. Do you think it's something that the government might look at? Or?
No, I think precisely for the reasons that Anoosh says. I mean, they are trying to reduce the incentives for people to come to Britain. And clearly, if asylum seekers are allowed to work, that would create a new one.
Let's talk about your piece, which is basically an assessment of Labour's first year in office and all of the multiple crises that it's facing, from the economy to the NHS doctors' strikes to Gaza to polling to the new left-wing party. It's quite comprehensive. There's a lot in there. But let's start with the exclusive More in Common polling that you looked at for this, which finds that only 22% of Brits believe the country is on the right track. That actually seemed quite high to me.
Well, it maybe seems quite high until you think of the 60% who think it's on the wrong track. So there aren't many who say don't know. And look, I think there are, what's perhaps surprising maybe to listeners is that when you speak to people in government, they will say things like, look, voters are pissed off and they're right to be pissed off. No, we're not going to turn around, as they would see it, 13 years of major policy mistakes and misgovernment in a year. And one Number 10 aide said to me recently that, in some ways the cost of living crisis has ended when you had that big inflation spike around energy prices, when inflation went up to 11%. But it's revealed something much deeper, which is a profound living standards crisis, in their words, that's really been there since the crash. You've never seen wage growth recover to the levels before the crash. And as a result, there's just a sense that we've become a poorer country and that people can't afford the things they want in life and expect.
Like I said, there's lots of different areas of this, but you kind of start off with the resident doctors' strikes, which the first lot have now finished, but the risk of industrial action, particularly in the NHS, but also in other public service areas, remains a real challenge for the government. Why start there? How big of a problem is that, and what does it say about the kind of multi-challenges facing the government?
I think it reflects two challenges. One is around NHS waiting lists, which have come down since their peak, but are still over 7 million. Number 10 believes that the big two political priorities, the cost of living in NHS, perhaps you could add immigration and issues around security as a third. And the government made much of reaching a settlement with the doctors early after coming into office.
Yeah, within weeks.
Now that's at risk. But secondly, the doctors have become emblematic of a newly militant middle class, as I put it. So the BMA is not traditionally regarded as sort of hotbed of leftism, but broad left, one of the influential factions within the BMA, their logo is a stethoscope in the style of a hammer and sickle, which gives you an idea of their sort of radicalism. And look, this reflects a country where obviously under Jeremy Corbyn, who's back at the centre of politics with this New Left Party, Labour won 40% of the vote, which was much higher than most commentators expected. And people in some areas have undoubtedly been radicalised by the state of the country. And I think that's a challenge for Labour when you are broadly trying to offer a pragmatic, social democratic approach. Unless Labour is seen to have made enough progress on these challenges soon enough, then the risk is that people will be attracted to more radical alternatives on left and right. And
Anoosh, you're nodding along. Do you think that's what's happening?
I think so, yeah. I mean, a lot of what I hear, and I'm sure you hear this too, George, from the public is, whose side are they on? I thought Labour was the party that was for the people, that was, not going to be the party that attacked pensioners and took our benefits away and, various other accusations about the policies that they've imposed. Water, not nationalising the water industry as well. That's something that I heard when I was in Marlborough, of all places. A town that has never been anything but conservative for a century in terms of its constituencies. So I think there's a lot of that. And actually, I spoke to More in Common, not to make this a sort of More in Common sponsored podcast, but
we do love More in Common.
Yeah, Luke Trill of More in Common told me that when he asks people in his focus groups or polls, sort of whose side people think Labour is on, the top is the rich, the second is immigrants, and the third is big business. So I think that's a big problem for Labour, because whether you like them or loathe them, their brand is that they are the party for
working people,
or people who are struggling, and So when they go against the grain of that, I think that's when the reputation really starts to plummet.
Well, George, you write in the piece about this split in the cabinet or the party actually in general, and it's not necessarily between right and left, it's between sort of incrementalism, small c conservatism, small changes like the way that the Prime Minister described things to Tom McTague, our editor, in that cover feature that he did, versus the people who go, no, we need something more radical.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily a left-right
yes.
divide.
So as I say, there are some splits which are traditional left-right ones, splits over welfare cuts, taxes. I mean,
wealth tax,
we've seen this under every Labour government since the 1920s in some ways. But as I say, I think there is another split, which is between those who, as you say, think the strategy is basically right and will work given time. Labour shows progress on all of those key areas. And then there are others who think, no, Britain's at a turning point here and we need something fundamentally has to change. Whether it's Andy Burnham in his new radical era saying we should embrace electoral reform and a multi-party future, or whether it's cabinet ministers I speak to who want a much more radical examination of what the state should do and would like to see, say, the welfare system shift from one based on need to one based on contribution, have a much bigger discussion about welfare than the cuts to disability benefits allowed. And I think that you're going to see that tension play out across this parliament because it's a difference of temperament as much as one of ideology.
And finally, the piece is called Summer of Discontent. It's taking into account the riots that we saw last summer in the wake of the Southport attacks. But this stuff is underlying and structural. It's not just about sort of one moment or one issue. So do you think that it's going to get better? Do you think there's an opportunity for it to get better? Is it going to become, a parliament of discontent?
Well, it's interesting. At the number 10 summer media reception, at the end of his short speech, Keir Starmer, he'd referenced the Lionesses' success. They went on to win the Euros 5 days later. He referenced the return of Oasis. And he said, obviously, one difference with the 1990s is the poll ratings, but things can only get better. So invoking New Labour's anthem. And things are very different. It is an amazing stat, which is that it took until the year 2000 and the fuel strikes, which some may remember or have read about, for Tony Blair to briefly lose his poll lead to the Conservatives. It did not take long at all for Labour to lose its poll lead, and I think reform has led pretty consistently since the local elections. So, as you say, the big question is whether that can change. But I think what's certainly the case is we're in a much more volatile and unpredictable political environment, and you were simply not going to see a return to the pre-crash norms of British politics. That sort of drama and chaos is here to stay. And I think that's why I think you will see, particularly as we get close to conference and this big defining budget, which I also touch on, much more intense debate within Labour about what it should do.